Welcome to Cultivating Brave Spaces in English Classrooms, Equity in Action. You are in for a treat today, whether you're here live or you're watching us on the YouTube video. If you are watching us on the YouTube video, no, you cannot get a certificate, but you can get the knowledge. And right underneath this video, you can click on details or description or whatever you want to call it, and you can go ahead and get the resource for today. So I've been waiting for this session. Every time we go through all of the different sessions that we have coming up, I've said, if you haven't heard Dr. Sawsan speak, are you even living, right? Like, are you even alive? So this is the day, everyone. So I am Dr. Desiree Alexander. I am the founder, CEO of Educator Alexander Consulting. Woo woo, and I am your host for today. And these are all the different ways that you can contact me. Yay! And now, what do we have coming up next? In March, a little bit, skip a weekend, then we're going to be back with Empowering Student Voice with Tech Twos with the lovely Debbie. Debbie is a friend of EA. She comes and does a whole bunch of webinars for us. She's going to be talking about empowering that student voice. And then we have a BER session for ELA teachers. So this is a paid session. So see if you want to attend. There's 2 in April. And then we have digital storytelling in the classroom. Again, the amazing Victoria Thompson. She has come and done one with us before. So she's going to be back talking about digital storytelling in April. And then Debbie comes on back around, Tech Up Math. Like, I know it's one of those subjects where they're like, I can't use technology, I teach math. Yes, you can. So come and find out how. And then we have talking about the educational leadership test. So if you are in a state that uses the SLLA test and you want to become an educational leader, I'm going to be talking about that test and how to get in that right mindset. And then we have affinity groups, creating a space for self-advocacy for Muslim Arab female students. So honestly, if you have Muslim Arab female students, you want to attend this session. But even if you don't, you want to attend this session and you want to learn about affinity groups, what they are, how can we make our classrooms a place of belonging. So I will be at ISTE, and this, of course, is a paid conference. So there you go. And then we have Shift the Mood of Your Classroom by Becoming Trauma Informed. This is a brand new session. I haven't even put it on Twitter yet. So there you go. Saturday, August 26th, talking about being trauma informed and how that affects our students and how we can make our classroom, again, more belonging. And then we have, all this AI stuff, right? Like, what is all this AI stuff? So our resident AI person, I feel like she has been with EA webinars from the beginning. NFTS in education, what do we need to know? Anytime we have an AI topic, we're like, Rochelle, come tell us about it. And then we have the smart way to write IEP goals and objectives. So I feel like Dr. Marilyn has actually become our resident SPED person now, because this is, I think, her 3rd or 4th session with us. I think just this year, just talking about the different things to do for IEP and SPED students. And then we have learning in the metaverse. Rochelle's coming on back and telling us, like, we keep hearing that, like, what is the metaverse? What is that? How do we use it? Do I pay for it? I don't know. So we're going to find out about the metaverse. And there you go. We are having about 2 or 3 more sessions that we're planning, again, still for this year. So y'all, there's so much learning. We always have our self-paced courses that's going through all kinds of different test prep, like Google Level 1, Level 2, and SLLA and all that good stuff. And remember that if you want to create a webinar, if you want to perform a webinar, if you just want to learn something specific, fill this out, because this is how I get some topics. And I reach out to certain people and go, hey, can you talk about this topic? I can't. And then they come and they talk about that topic. So there you go. Woo! That was a lot. Remember, you can get to all of those sessions on one website. And go ahead, you can go to educatoralexander.com and click on upcoming events, and you can go ahead and register for all of those amazing, amazing sessions. So, I feel like I should play music right now. This is what you came for. I cannot wait. I knew about Dr. Sawsan way before I met her. I was a fan So when I met her, I just fangirled out, and she is just simply authentic. That, I mean, you know, we get a lot of different stuff, and not all of it is authentic, right? Let's be real. Like, there's a lot of performative kind of stuff. She's just the real deal. And I cannot wait for you to enjoy and learn from this session. So to do that, I have to be quiet, right? So I'm going to go ahead and shut my mouth, and we are going to get to what you came here for, creating those brave spaces.
That's a lot of pressure, Dr. Alexander, a lot of pressure. And Dr. Alexander is the amazing one, for her to be able to create these platforms for everybody and provide professional development and just be so supportive. My students and I love Dr. Alexander. We got to engage with each other in IdeaCon this year, and she was just a powerhouse and super supportive of the kids. Even the kids were like, she's amazing. And so thank you, Dr. Alexander, for just being you and for being amazing always. So I always like to start every session with a little quote. And I love Shane Saphir and Jamila Dugan's book, Street Data. And so usually I have it kind of just sitting there while people are walking into a session or walking into or coming into a virtual space. But I think it kind of frames our conversation. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to read this quote, and either in the chat, if you can, in the chat, kind of tell me what you're hearing. What is this quote lifting for you? Definitely not standardized teaching, but actually teaching the actual student. All right, well, what I really wanted to elevate was kind of the correlation between student agency and self-concept, right? Because we constantly in education talk about making sure that students have agency and giving students agency. And when the Danielson came out, I think the biggest word that came out for teachers was, your role is changing to a facilitator, right? You're no longer the center of a classroom and the center of instruction, but you're more of the facilitator in the classroom. Teaching, I'm thinking teaching to the student we have and not changing. Yeah, absolutely. Which is something that I think is a lot more difficult, right, and challenging, given the limitations that we have in education and really getting to know students, or ways that we ourselves as educators have been educated to get to know students. Oftentimes, all those get to know you activities really sit at the surface of who students are, right? So I think one of the first questions that we need to ask ourselves as educators in a space is, how do we really get to the core of who students are so that we can help them love who they are enough to really develop that sense of agency? And then when they have that sense of agency, right, we can then shape instruction, design instruction, co-design instruction in order for us to really include and you know, have this process where students' voice and student agency is at the center of everything that we're developing. But if students have no self-concept, if everything around them is telling them that who they are isn't good enough, if everything around them is telling them that they have to leave parts of themselves at the schoolroom door or the classroom door, they will never get to the point where that agency is there in order for them to be leaders in that space or any other space outside. Because if we want to think about the longevity of a school career, right, from the time that kids are starting to open their eyes into the world and develop that sense of self, they're spending more time in school spaces than they are most of the time with their parents. And so what we tell them and what we make them feel in our classroom spaces is really cultivating that sense of self that they have in many ways, right? And that is the exception where a student can come into a school space and be told that he or she isn't good enough, and then still feel like they're empowered to be who they are on the outside. And so thinking about, I always say, like, we are in the business of crafting humans, right? And when we craft those humans, we're ultimately choosing and deciding what the landscape of the communities that we take space up in look like, right? Because eventually our humans are going to leave our school spaces and they're going to become professionals in a career world. And that thinking of that self-concept, that perception of the world itself, everything that they've taken from this K-12 space, in addition to what they learn from their families at home, becomes how they project and how they walk in the world. And so when we think about the power of education and the power of educators in a classroom space, it's massive, right? And so in the session today, what we're going to be focusing on is how can we really develop a strong student self-concept to the point where students can really self-advocate, where they can be civically engaged, where they can partake in co-designing and co-creating in the classroom and become the main resource in the classroom, versus us kind of working through a lot of these challenges that are happening in many spaces in education where there's censorship and lists are having to get approved in the process. I heard a friend of mine in a different district talking about the approval process of getting a novel in a classroom is 4 years, right? By the time that book is approved, the classes that you're kind of trying to shape instruction for have moved on. And I'm 100% sure the demographic of the city that you're teaching is probably very different, right? With the speed that demographics are changing in the communities that we're residing in, it's probably going to be irrelevant. And there's going to be so many more new texts by the time the book gets approved. So how can we work around that in many of these spaces? And so the session is called Creating Brave Spaces, Equity in Action. And I'm really, really intentional about saying that this is a brave space because it's super uncomfortable for everybody, right? And so it's definitely not a safe space. And when we are creating safe spaces for kids, we're not expanding that kind of that rubber band for them to really grow their capacity and be uncomfortable in the process of growing that capacity for a lot of different things, whether it's skills-based or identity-based or understanding others in this space. All of that requires them being brave and not necessarily being safe. But it also means that we have to become transformative equity. And that's something that I'm going to talk about throughout the session. What does that look like, right? Because oftentimes now this like equity word is being thrown around in so many school spaces. And what's happening is that we are more performative than we are transformative. It's not really making a difference, the work that's happening in many of our school spaces. So how can we actually do things within our locus of control in classrooms as classroom teachers in order for us to make equity happen? But how does it become a state of being for us? How does it become a state of being for our students? And how do we transfer that into the community at large that we're taking space in? And so with that, I'm going to solidify the work and in that process, tell you a little bit about myself. Here's our why, right? And this is a story that's really born out of love, hate, misrepresentation, and misunderstanding. And I'll say that because I think my career as a student, and that has continued through my profession as an educator in public spaces, has been really charged with a lot of misunderstanding about my identities, about the intersections of my identity. And obviously, you can just look at me and see that I walk around with markers that I can't shed or hide, right? Whether it's my brown skin, my hijab, the fact that I'm a female, all of these intersections are problematic in our current environment. And so I will talk about that as well. I always introduce myself as a storyteller. The reason I introduce myself as a storyteller is because I grew up immersed in stories that really shape my identity. I believe in the power of storytelling. If you ask me, that's one of the reasons why CRT is so weaponized right now, is because it really does talk about the counter story. And I think that there's so much power in people telling their own stories that that's what we're afraid of. And so as an Arab, I grew up as a Palestinian, particularly. My grandfather was a survivor of the Palestinian, our village being massacred in 1948, the first village to be massacred by the occupation. And he survived and saved 2 of his sisters as he watched other siblings of his. He was one of 9 children. 2 of his brothers were massacred. My great-grandmother was the midwife. She literally took arms and fought and saved the mayor of the city on her back and walked for miles and days. They were separated. So those are the stories that we grew up listening to. Although I didn't have the opportunity or privilege of visiting Palestine until I was an adult, the stories made me love Palestine, and the blood of Palestine's in my blood and in my veins in every way. I couldn't be any more in love with Palestine if I grew up there, because of the stories that were shared and that we were immersed in. And the love for social justice really comes from that background of having parents who lived in Palestine and grew up as refugees in refugee camps and came here because they wanted to establish a better future for their children. As a Muslim, just like the Bible, the Quran is full of parables and stories. And so I grew up in a very religious family, and much of what we learned about our faith came from stories as children of prophets and caliphs, and just stories about, like, you know, values and justice, again, as a really core value of the Islamic faith, really, really contrary to what most people believe about the faith in general, right? As an American, I feel like I am as much American as I am Palestinian. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in a very diverse community. Obviously, New York, I feel like, because it's always been the hub of immigration, has always been diverse. And so, like, my upbringing was one where, you know, the neighborhood and the community really celebrated everything together, from the 4th of July to just having a neighborhood bake out, and everybody would bring something sweet and kind of meet in the street and just get to know each other. And so it was a really beautiful kind of upbringing. But the school space, even in that neighborhood, there was a demographic divide like most of our schools in our country today. And the acceptance of Black and brown bodies in that space, even in the 80s, was very evidently not, it wasn't there. And so my earliest memory goes back to being 6 years old and feeling like who I was not exactly who my teacher wanted me to be. And so from very, very early ages, I realized that my American identity was silencing, and my American identity was silencing my Arab and Muslim stories, right? And so those intersections were things that I struggled to bring to public spaces, particularly to educational spaces as a professional, until I one day was presenting in front of a group of teachers and realized that I was suppressing a really big part of my identity subconsciously. And I had this really emotional reaction to the fact that I was suppressing it. And then realized that I was a hypocrite, because here I was telling my students that I wanted them to be unapologetically who they are and have this strong self-concept. And in the back of my mind, I was socialized for so many years, all the way through graduate school, to hold back a piece of myself, because I knew that claiming my Palestinian identity in a lot of ways was going to be hurtful in a professional setting, and it has been. But I came to terms in that moment that I was never going to hold back who I was, regardless of what the consequences of that was. And so for many reasons, I wasn't able to grow in school systems because of my advocacy for Palestine and my very visible Islamic identity. So that's why I decided to kind of pave my own path and not let the gatekeepers determine which way I was going to go. But that took a lot of work, internal introspective work, but also a lot of work to really shape a path for myself outside. And all throughout that process, right, I had children. My children's situation was getting a lot more aggressive in schools. The anti-Islamic and anti-Arab hate, especially post 9/11 and then post-Trump, was really getting more aggressive. So I started to see things getting worse and not better, and started to think about, like, how is this impacting the self-concept of the kids in our community? And what does that look like? And who's advocating for them, right? Where is there even representation in the educational realm of Arab and Muslim, and particularly Palestinian bodies, when there's bipartisan support for our occupiers, and we are actually sending funds, tax dollars, to support an occupation that's literally killing our people? And so how do we have these really difficult conversations so that kids and adults like myself don't have to go through most of their career and their education thinking, how do I come to terms with my American identity when it's at odds with all these other intersections that are a part of who I am? Right? And that's where this class came from, where the shape of the curriculum kind of took place, because I started to realize that if teachers had these conversations with me as an adult, as a child, as in high school or middle school, I probably would have had a lot of those realizations much sooner, and it would have changed the whole trajectory of my life. And so I realized that we are not doing students a service when we're not telling them the things, when we're not helping them kind of navigate their identities, when we're not helping them navigate the world and reading it and understanding it. And so that's kind of the crux of the backstory where a lot of this came from. I am an English teacher. I've been teaching, this is my 24th year. I've been teaching since I was 19. I graduated from college when I was 19, and I've been teaching since. I'm a mother of 3 beautiful children. I am also a consultant. I do a lot of consulting work outside of the educational, the K-12 sphere, because I feel like I have the ability to have a lot of impact. But like I said earlier, the gatekeepers don't see me in a lot of those internal building positions. And so I've had to kind of carve my own path outside and really engage with. And that's how I met amazing people like Desiree and other people in my national PLN that really fill my cup and support me and understand and embrace all of my identities and who I am in real ways. And so this has, this curse in a lot of ways has blessed me in so many ways as well, because it's opened up opportunities and doors where if I became a building principal or a director of curriculum in a building, which was my ultimate goal, I probably wouldn't have never had the opportunity of engaging with so many beautiful communities nationally and internationally. And so now I know that isn't what I want anymore. And it probably wasn't meant to be for a lot of really great reasons. And so although it's something that I feel like is sad that it's the reality that wasn't an option for me, but it's been a better opportunity for me in a lot of different ways. And so I always start with this story, and I'm going to share a bunch of stories as we progress through the presentation. And this is a story that really, I think, really opened my eyes to a lot of the realities of kids in schools. And this is a story of, I was teaching in my class on a Monday morning in a district that was historically homogenous, white, Caucasian school district, but a mosque opened in the area, and there was a 600% growth of Arab and Muslim kids in the district. I just moved back from Dubai and an FMLA position in the district opened. So I applied for it and got it. I was the first brown teacher in the district, literally the first brown, like even our Spanish teachers were white. Everybody in the district was white. So when I walked in on in-service day, the first day of school, I stood out like a sore thumb. Parents walked into my classroom on curriculum night and said, oh, we can't have her teaching our kids, and transferred their kids out of my classroom. I had a student walk into my class the first week and said, my dad said you're a terrorist. And I was like, okay, let's have this conversation. And then a month into the school year, a teacher, a social studies teacher nonetheless, walked into my classroom on a Monday morning, put her hands on my shoulder in front of my students and asked me how I felt after what my people did in France that weekend. And on like a regular Monday morning, right? Like Monday mornings are the hardest, but I stood there, I was confused. I didn't know what she was referencing. It took me a minute to realize that she was referencing an ISIS bombing in France that weekend. And so in that moment, I had a bunch of different like things that came to the surface for me. I was worrying about how to address this issue with my students who were standing and witnessing this kind of conversation, this dialogue. How do I address this teacher who I don't believe that she intended to harm? I think that it was just really an ignorant comment on her part and she didn't know better. But my biggest concern was, how is this teacher who teaches kids who look like me every single day perpetuating harm on students with her perception of their identity, right? And I was just at the kind of the beginning of determining what my dissertation topic for my doctoral studies were. And I was going to focus on something with professional development and teachers. And in that moment, literally that moment, I decided that I had to focus on the experiences and perceptions of inclusion and belonging of Arab and Muslim students in public sector, especially in historically homogenous school districts, because it was a gap in the research and because there was no information on what this kind of anti-Islamic sentiment generally in our country was, how it was impacting kids and their identities in general. And especially because not many people know the difference between a Muslim and an Arab in general. And so the blanket kind of understandings of those identities, for the most part, were being perpetuated on Arab students, Muslim students, and kids who had Arab identity markers, like physical Arab identity markers, were all at the receiving end of anti-Islamic and anti-Arab hate, especially post 9/11 and especially post-Trump. And so this became the topic of my doctoral studies. And one of the first things in my lit review that I learned was 1 in 3 Arab American students was being bullied by a teacher. And I kind of want to take a second to just let us sit with that for a second. 1 in 3, right? Who are teachers in professional spaces and educational spaces? We're the ones that are supposed to be making the space safe. And oftentimes when we're sitting in professional developments, we're sitting in professional developments on how we can limit bullying from student to student. These are kids who are not only receiving bullying from their peers for the same reasons that every kid is bullied by peers, for their weight, for their appearance, for their sports ability or lack of it, all these different things, for their academic ability, for just being, mean, because kids are mean to each other, especially at middle school levels and adolescent ages, when we start to notice differences, but they were being bullied by their educators because of who they were. And there was nothing out there. Like, this was one of 2 studies that I found on Arab American students in general. And so I really started to dig into those things and realize that as an Arab Palestinian, you're automatically considered anti-Semitic and un-American. As a Muslim, you are considered a terrorist and un-American as well. Banks says that Arabs and Muslims are perpetual foreigners in the United States. As an American, I'm a perpetual foreigner. I never will belong. And the biggest testament to that is every time people get angry in the street, or like people want to like throw a comment at you, an ignorant comment, they say, go back to your country. And it's like, well, I was born in Brooklyn. I was born in Chicago, moved to Brooklyn when I was 3. I've been here all my life. This is my country, right? But to them, that's not the case, right? Because my hijab, my brown skin says otherwise. And as a female, I've always been considered subordinate, right? Especially as an Arab female, we are considered dominated women. And so I find myself walking through life, really working through a lot of those different markers. And so I realized that the intentionally erased, misrepresented histories can only be revived if members of those historically marginalized groups work to reclaim their narratives. As an educator, no matter how much I read, no matter how much I immerse myself in communities, and those are my responsibility to self-educate, I will never know everything about everybody because A, people are not a monolith. I teach in a beautiful, primarily Latinx community with a primarily Mexican student body. They're not the same, right? Their experiences are super different, naturalized, unnaturalized. How did they arrive here? Is it a normal family, like a traditional family structure, or is it something that's different? Do the students work? What's their socioeconomic demographic? What religion do they follow? What is the family dynamic? Is it a large family with extended family members living with them or not? Like all of these different things impact how people walk through life and the values that they hold. So no matter how much I study about the beautiful Mexican culture, there's no way that I'm going to understand every single student in my classroom. I will never be an expert on that culture. So what better way for me to get to know them is for me then to empower them to really tell me about who they are, all of my students, right? So I'm not just pointing out specific groups of students that I feel like I may not understand as well as others, but getting all of my kids to really talk about and reclaim their own narratives and share those narratives publicly, right? Those are the accurate mirrors. So when we're choosing texts, and oftentimes I'll talk about the Arab community again, when teachers are attempting to be culturally responsive to the Arab community, the text that's being chosen is the Kite Runner. And the Kite Runner, Khalid Hosseini, the author of the Kite Runner, is not an Arab. But again, the misunderstanding around Arab identities, most people don't know that he's not an Arab, so you're not being culturally responsive. He's not culturally responsive to Muslim students either, because the form of Islam represented in the text is an extremist form, and that's not the Islam that most Muslims follow, right? It's like saying that the cult form of Christianity is the kind of Christianity that most Christians follow, and that's not the case. And so it's not a text that is representative of anybody. So it's harmful to the kids of that community, but it's also harmful to kids outside of that community because that becomes the only window they have into the community that we're representing when we're trying to teach this text. So we always talk about intent versus impact, right? Well-intentioned, harmful impact is the worst because you're running with something thinking that it's good for your kids, but the reality is it's more harmful than it is good. It's harmful for those kids who are immersed in those texts and it's stereotypical of who they are, but it's also harmful for other kids who may not have any other window into that community and culture. And then it becomes their only understanding, and that's what they have to move with. So how can we get kids to really claim their narratives and tell their narratives, right? And really thinking about the fact that we are cultivating the future. We really are, right? And I always say to my students, I'm going to get old. I'm getting old, and my knees will tell that story, right? And when I do, who's taking over? It's these kids. These kids are going to be the next Supreme Court judges, the next teachers, the next doctors, the next president, the next everything. Who do we want to take over, right? How do we make sure that these kids are critically conscious? How are they aware of the world and the people in it? How are they voting? How are they leading? Right. And I can't help but think, like, in every single main case that we've seen take over in the media, from George Floyd to Tyre Nichols, to every single story that we're seeing, how would it have been different if one or two of the people involved in those stories was sitting in a classroom like this, where they were being critically conscious of the world? Would it have changed the narrative and the fate of the victims in those stories? What kind of kids do we want to take over? We have to ask those questions, right? Our legacy is not what we leave behind, but it's what we're building for the future as educators. And we have power, right? Anybody who says, I can't make these choices in a classroom because I'm just a teacher, you're making decisions for kids every single day. You have power. Your positionality in the building is one of power. You may not have power to change policy. You may not have power to bring in new curriculum, but you have power to make sure that every student feels seen, that they are respected, that you bring in resources that are respectable. And if you can't, you create space for them to create those resources so they are fair and accurate. And so I always do this. I would love for us to just kind of explore the world through the lens of so many of our students. And I'm just going to kind of put up a series of images that I want everybody to just sit with for a second, and then we can talk about how important it is for us to really be able to read the world with our kids. Right. And I always give George Floyd a full screen because it's the murder of George Floyd that happened publicly during a time when people had nothing else to do but be stuck to their TV screens. He's the reason, his murder is the reason that we're having these conversations at all in education today. Right. And he's not the first Black man or the last Black man to be murdered by police officers, but his murder happened at an opportune time where the world criticized America for inaction of things that were happening for decades. And so when we think about our students and what they're walking in with, how are we helping them read the world? The world, what stories is the world telling them? Right? How, as an English teacher, am I an effective English teacher if when my students walk in with all of these things that they're immersed in and they're feeling, right? I teach in a primarily Latinx community. The cages on the southern border, the deportation, DACA, all of those things directly impact my students. How am I going to say, hey guys, let's do similes and metaphors today, knowing that some of them are being directly impacted as we speak by these things, and I'm not addressing it. Roe versus Wade, when that got overturned, my students came in and said, Dr. Jaber, can we please talk about it? Right? We need to process it somewhere. This is a safe space. And then how do I actually do that in addition to or alongside all of the skills and standards that we have to be teaching as an English teacher, right? The world is a hidden curriculum, and it's the best curriculum for us to be teaching because ultimately we're shaping students to go out into that real world and be impactful. And as educational systems, the capitalist perspective of we want them to get good jobs so that they can make money, that hasn't worked for us ever. It's not working for us now, right? Our perspective has to be that we want students to be successful members of a larger community. What does that look like? Part of it is getting good jobs and making money, but another part of it is being able to impact the communities that they take space in civically, right? Being able to shift the status quo, being able to have a voice in those spaces and feel unapologetic about who they are in those spaces, right? Because history shows us that members of these communities have not had that privilege, right? And so how do we teach students to notice, name, and interrupt? That becomes the key, right? And how do we have conversations when, you know, students come in and say, well, Dr. Jaber, there were 5 Black police officers. That's Black on Black violence, right? How do we get them to understand that this is socialization? That Tyree Nichols' case is like Officer Gomez in The Hate U Give. And these are Black and brown people who have grown up immersed in many of these systems that that are here and haven't done the work in order for them to understand that they have also been socialized, right? How do we have those conversations to differentiate and understand all of these different things that are happening in our world so that we're critically conscious and asking the right questions and navigating them properly, right? And so my students in junior year and senior year are coming in and they're asking to have these conversations because they want to understand. And then through that, they're creating, right? And we understand that what we don't say as educators in this classroom space is impactful as what we do say, because silence is the loudest weapon. Silence is the loudest, is like louder than anything else that you have to say. And so when we're being silent, we're making a really loud statement. Right. And so we have to address these issues. We have to talk about them. And the reality is when fear is elevated, and this is something we talk about in my class all the time, right? Rationale is diminished. So what better way is for us to eliminate the fear than by educating ourselves, because we fear what we don't understand, right? And what better space is there for us to do that than in an English classroom? So we're going to start talking about how to reframe the practices, right? How do we deconstruct so that we can reconstruct new understandings? Because again, we've all been socialized from the same school systems. We've all been trained by the same teacher programs. And this is not the way that we were trained for the most part. And so that really becomes, again, a conversation about transformative versus mitigative equity. And in a lot of school spaces, we throw in a diverse book in a curriculum and we're like, okay, great. We are now responsive, right? We've checked off the list. We've done our job. We've done 15-minute implicit bias training, like in my previous school, that's on through a screen. And we think we're great to go, right? Because nobody gets into education so that they can harm students. Well, the reality is it's only transformative if we are really building these skills in students to be able to self-advocate. And we're not afraid of them holding us accountable if we make mistakes, and we will make mistakes, right? Because when you're doing this work, you are going to make mistakes, but we have to be really careful on naming those mistakes and growing from them so that we're not perpetuating harm on students, but doing the work in order to avoid making them to begin with altogether. And so the focuses of a liberatory curriculum, it starts with self-awareness, right? It starts with students really being aware and you being aware of your identity, your bias, your privilege. What's the impact of your epistemology? How do you know what you know? Where does it come from? right? Really asking yourself that, because when we establish the fact that we know what we know based on our lived experiences, we're no longer attacking each other on values or beliefs that we hold, but we try to understand the core of where those come from. And that is the beginning of a community kind of growing in our classroom space. Social awareness, reading the world, and understanding that our lived experiences really color our reading of the world, right? If I have a family member who is the victim of a police violence or a victim of guns or a victim, I'm going to have some very strong opinions on some of those things, right? Somebody who hasn't may not understand. And so really just understanding the fact that our lived experiences shape our values, and then again, getting to appreciate the fact that our lived experiences differ, is the beginning of us learning that I may not have the same value as you. I may not agree with your religion. I may not agree with your value, your culture, your different things, but I can respect and appreciate and empathize with where that comes from. And those are the foundational steps of having these critical conversations. Once we are there, then we can start with storytelling, right? And really interrogating, whose stories are we hearing? Who's telling the story, right? What stories are being amplified? And then thinking about what stories aren't in the space, how can we amplify those stories? And then thinking about the concept of social change. And I always ask my students, now that you know, what are you going to do with what you know? Because sitting in a conversational space isn't good enough. Everything that we do has to be a conduit to action. So what are we going to do with this information that we're having this conversation about? And so it's a mindset shift, and there's 5 of them that I'm going to go through really quickly. We have to stop talking about doing equity and turning it on like a button and turning it off, and we have to think about being equity, right? It is a lifestyle. It is who you are. It is a part of everything that you do. It's about how you place yourself socially outside of school spaces. In an interesting conversation with a school that I was working with, administrators were asked to go interview a BIPOC person in their social circles. This is a primarily white male administration. And almost every single one came back the next day and said, I realized that I didn't have one. I didn't have a BIPOC person in my social circle. How do you walk into a school space then and teach BIPOC students and feel like your perspectives are accurate and the way you view them and understand them is accurate? If there's nobody, if you have positioned yourself around people who look like you outside of school. Right. So when you're being equity, you're thinking about that. You're thinking about where you live. You're thinking about who your friends are. You're thinking about how you advocate in your children's space, right? Even if they're not being directly affected. If you are white and your kids go to an all-white school, how is your school preparing those kids to go into more diverse workspaces and educational spaces and interact thoughtfully and empathetically and through understanding and learning and knowledge with kids who don't look like them, right? Because even in those spaces, this work needs to happen, right? Working for students, we need to stop working for kids and we need to start working with them, right? That's a really big mindset shift. We are not the experts of their lives, they are. And if we are working for them, that's where that well-intentioned harm is happening, right? Because we think we understand, we think we know, and we don't. So really thinking about the demographic divide and thinking about all of these different things, here's just a list of questions that people can ask, right? What kind of school did you go to? What were your experiences? What were racial patterns that you experienced? If your school was perceived as racially diverse, what races were more represented, right? All of these different things. And I know this is going to be shared, so you'll have access to these questions to kind of understand or kind of walk through yourself and ask yourself and self-interrogate. But thinking about positionality, right? How do we position ourselves with race, class, power? How are we positioned in the classroom? Just in that space, you automatically have the power, impact versus intent. And the reality is that the only person who is an expert of a group's lived experience is a member of that group. I don't care how much we study or read about a group, we're not the experts in that, right? We are the experts in our own lived experience, and that's it. And so this becomes even more important for us to really think about. The third one is centering culture. We're constantly talking about cultural responsiveness, culturally sustaining, culturally relevant, right? But when we center only culture, we forget all of those other things that cause inequity: socioeconomics, religion, gender, sexuality, all of these different things that kind of go under the surface that are all things that cause inequity. So when we have to center equity. How do we center equity? And then when we're centering equity, we're thinking about what are the things in this space that are causing inequities and how can I address them, right? And culture is definitely one of those things, but it's not the only thing. The fourth one is we're constantly skilling and drilling kids on skills, especially if you're a state that is really standardized test driven. or a district that's really standardized test driven. And the reality is that's all short-term memory building, right? It's not skills that the kids are going to take with them, but when you're teaching in this way, this becomes the way of learning. So we are focusing on developing identity, criticality, intellectualism, and skills, as Goldie Muhammad talks about in her book, Cultivating Genius, because that is what kids need to be doing. So it's not like I'm teaching this or I'm teaching the skills, but it's like, how do I teach the skills through these conversations? It's and when that happens, like my department chair always says, this is the only class that I walk into where there's not a single kid on their cell phone most of the time, right? Because the kids are engaged. They want to do this work. And even after they've left me, and you're going to hear from some of my students a little later, even after they've left our class, these are kids that still engage in a lot of the work that they're doing, right? They're not stopping the work because it becomes who they are, it becomes a part of their identity. They become equity, like we talked about earlier. And the last one is considering a public or classroom space apolitical. The reality is they are political, right? And we are shaping kids to think one way or another. And the reality is that critical conversations about real world issues are the foundation to democratic societies. They have to be there. And by not teaching kids how to engage democratically in a society, in a country where we tell the whole world we're the epitome of democracy, then we're not doing students a service, we're failing them. Right? So yes, absolutely, it is political. And so we're going to talk about pedagogy and practice, the power in the product, the power of the story. And that's what we're going to focus on in English more than anything else, because in my class, we talk about how many ways do you tell a story, right? And so we humanize, we heal, we connect, we inspire, we preserve, we redefine and transform, all through the story and the counter story, right? Stories have the power to do all of these things. And the reality is that historically, BIPOC members, people at the margins, they are not the ones telling their own story, right? I will speak again to the Arab and Islamic communities. We have never told our own stories. And that's why there's such a culture of fear around who we are. So the reality is, and this is something I start the year with every single year, is until the lion learns to write, every story will always glorify the hunter, right? Even though the lion put on a good fight and he was the one that there was a disproportionate use of power, right? He didn't have the weapon. The hunter did. So we will never hear the story of the lion because he's the less powerful one in this scenario. We will always hear the story of the hunter and how glorious the hunter is. So until we really teach kids to tell their own stories and glorify their experiences and talk about their experiences and highlight them and love them enough and see them from a place of an asset and a place of beauty and a place of pride, right? We're never hearing those stories. And so getting them to understand the power of a story, the power of a counter story, and I call it a counter story because it counters what's actually out there, the single story that's out there about most of our marginalized groups, right? We know from the 1920s, from Birth of a Nation, right? The Black man has been over-sexualized and criminalized. So much of that fear that exists around Black bodies comes from slavery, but so much of it exists from a movie called Birth of a Nation, right? It allowed all of these different things to happen to Black men since the 1920s that we've continued to perpetuate until our jails, right? 25%, we are 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prison population. It's not because Americans and Black men particularly are more violent than anybody else, which is what we believe. There is something wrong with those numbers, right? And we have to be asking those questions. And so we're going to talk about our scholar activists and kind of just talk about, I have a video here, but I'm not going to show the video. I'm going to have the students talk about their own experiences. So let me just get to a kind of curriculum structure really quick. We start the year out by learning, and it's really interrogating our own positionality, who we are as people. And anytime the students participate in anything, oftentimes we sit in a circle in the center of the classroom when we're sharing, and I share with my kids too. It's really important for them to see that I'm leading that work in all these different ways. We link the second third of the year. We talk about what voices are eliminated from the mainstream, the stories, and we really elevate those stories and what counter stories we need to be telling in order for us to really create a more accurate understanding of different bodies in our American history. So we start with the Native Americans, and we don't look at it from a historical perspective. We look at it from a now perspective, a current perspective. Where are they now, right? And how did they get here? We trace back the history to kind of understand the trajectory of how people ended up where they are today. So when we talk about the prison population, when we talk about the poor Black neighborhoods, when we talk about Black on Black violence, when we talk about the Native American lifespan being an average of 40 years old, the suicide rates, the human trafficking, the sexual trafficking in Native American reservations, all of these different things. We talk about the Middle East and the American support of things that are happening or lack of support. We talk about Asian bodies. We talk about all of these different communities, the southern border. We talk about the perception of people who come from countries like, from places like Mexico, and what that looks like, and what are the stereotypes around those identities, and how did we get to these understandings, and how about the Mexican War, right? Like how is most of our country, or how a lot of our country actually parts of Mexico, and how are Mexican people indigenous to this land, and what is that perception, and what does it actually mean, right? All of these different questions that we're really interrogating and asking. And it's important for them to understand that Native Americans are not black and white pictures that had existed when Christopher Columbus found this land, right? And I say that with air quotes because that's not the story, but that's what the story is in a lot of curriculum. But these are Native American people who are existing today, who are living in the worst dire conditions. What am I as a citizen of this country? What's my responsibility to elevating that story and working towards changing for people who don't have the ability or power right now to change for themselves? And as a citizen of this country, what is my invested interest as a social justice advocate, as an anti-racist, to elevate that story and work towards justice for those groups of people? Even if it doesn't directly impact me, it impacts me as a member of this country. Those are the questions that we're having. And we do all of this through literature. So we're reading poetry, we're reading short stories, we're reading research, actual peer edited research, that's the word I was looking for. We're reading all these different things, looking at documentaries, we're really interrogating all of these different identities through these different lenses, and we're linking, because once we link, we understand. As an American citizen, regardless of what and we already talked about the intersections of identities, privilege, all of these different things in the first unit, I have a responsibility towards working towards justice, right? And so now, in order for me to work towards justice, I need to first educate myself about what injustice looks like, the different systems that are operating in all of these different spaces, and how it's impacting various groups of people. And the link through all of the people and the students in the classroom is the idea of justice. And once we establish that, then the students lead. The question then becomes, activism has so many faces. How do you feel comfortable being an activist? What is your voice in this work? Now that you know, what are you going to do with what you know? And I call my students scholar activists, because first, everything that they do is grounded in education and understanding. And then they have to act based on those understandings. And so those are what we now are throwing around, the new keywords in education: mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, because they're creating those accurate mirrors by interrogating their positionality. Those become the windows for other students. And then the glass doors are the actions that they can take in order for them to really level out the playing field. And I feel like that's the most important part of this work, especially when you're dealing with middle school and high school kids. They need to see the hopeful piece of it. And that is something that we need to that needs to happen in the classroom, because if we just immerse them in these conversations, that's very heavy for anybody, for an adult. And so they need to feel like they have that direct impact, and that conduit needs to happen in the classroom, between the classroom and the real world. They need to see the real-time impacts of their activism in the classroom so that they can continue doing it. So that's a really key part of the Learn, Link, Lead model. And in between Link and Lead, I run a whole student equity conference where the kids are actually immersed in a day of conversation with specialists who are activists in their actual fields, who are defining what activism looks like. So we have people from the juvenile justice system, people from education, from journalism, from finance, all these different fields, from urban planning, who come in and kind of talk about and engage students in workshops, understanding how inequities are built into every system in the fabric of our country. And as professionals, how have they worked to notice, name, and interrupt those inequities in their professional spaces? And the last part of that day is what we call activist art. So spoken word art, resistance dance, all different kinds of art forms, fine art, all of it kind of storytelling and reclaiming narratives and shifting people's understandings of what they think they know. So it's a really powerful day for the kids. And then they are asked to think about how they would like to lead. And through this process, they're using their rhetoric, they're using their speaking and listening, they're using literature to analyze and interrogate. They're getting into deep understandings of synthesizing text across modes. It's multimodal. They're creating, so we do a read one, write one. Every poem they read, they write their own. That's amplifying their stories. So there's a lot of literature, English stuff happening in order for them to get to a point where then they decide, how am I going to use the skills I've acquired throughout the entire year to actually create outputs and impact people in order for me to pay on this information and pay it forward. And so they become content creators versus content consumers. And that's a really big shift. And so with that, I'm going to kind of leave the floor to the students to speak a little bit about their own experiences. And I'll stop talking. I think we said Melanie Lobus is going to go first. And I have two amazing powerhouses, so they're going to introduce themselves and kind of speak to you directly about their experiences, and then we can finish up with some questions and other things.
Hi, thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you for having me here. My name is Melanie Lobos, and my pronouns are she, her. I was born in Massachusetts, in Boston, Massachusetts, but I was raised in Guatemala, so I identify myself as Hispanic. And I think my why am I here? It's because I want to advocate for myself and I want to break stereotypes. Now, I want to present something about my journey that really helped me and advocate for myself, and it's my Weeklet page. I think you can see now, right? Okay, good. So a little bit about my journey and about me. I was raised in Guatemala, and I moved here in November of 2021. Now, I think my story of advocating for myself starts here. And here's a picture of me when I was in my first day of school in American high school. And I remember well. And I feel like when I moved here, I think I was placed in ELL classes. ELL means English as a language learner. And English was not my first language. So I was placed in a lot of ELL classes, and I felt like those ELL classes weren't rigorous enough for me. Now, here's a picture of my classes in my junior year. And oh yeah, so another thing about me, I'm a senior, and I moved I moved in my junior year and late in my junior year. And it was really difficult because I was not with my parents. I didn't move with my parents. I was living with my aunt and with my brother, and it's different. It's challenging, the transition from being in my country, my culture, the weather, and my language, to being here. And I felt I felt really sad, honestly. And when I came here, I was placed in ELL classes, and here are my ELL classes. You see here the course placed as ELL, and so yeah, here's my schedule, and I feel like those classes weren't rigorous enough for me. Now, I met Dr. Javer, and I felt like those classes, as I said, those classes weren't rigorous enough for me, and I felt like I could do more. And I didn't want my language to be a barrier. And so I advocated for myself, and I met Dr. Javer, and she was really helpful in elevating my voice, because I think like if I was silenced, I couldn't advocate for myself. And so this is my schedule now. In 1 year, I transitioned from EL classes to AP classes, and I felt like this transition really shaped who I am. And it was challenging at first, but I felt like if I didn't advocate for myself, I couldn't be where I am now. And so my point from this is that I was told by not only by students, but only by teachers as well, that I belong to EL classes. And so I didn't want my language to be a barrier, and I really wanted to advocate for myself. And now you see here, I won the award for mathematics and for like in my school, and I also won so many awards after being in the United States. And so, and I also did 2 AP classes like self-studying, and I got a 5. I was the first one in my school history to do the AP German exam, and I got I got a 5, even though I self-studied for it. Now, and this was a great achievement for me because I wanted to demonstrate that just because I'm from a third world country, that doesn't mean I can achieve in education. And now this is my equity work continued, and how I'm continuing my work outside the classroom, and how it is impactful for me in so many ways. I'm a student from the Excellent STEM Academy, Leadership Academy, and we ran a summer program every summer. And I was a student last summer, and here's an article about me. And I think, as I said, I want to break stereotypes, and I want all women, and not all women, but all students, to advocate for themselves, because I think sometimes they don't have a voice, and sometimes they don't have a room for that voice. And with this program, and also what I learned from this Jaber's class, is that I mean, often women are giving toys based on what society expects from them. And I think that everyone can advocate for themselves. And here are some pictures and some articles about me. I'm also in Student Equity Board, which is we meet monthly, or sometimes like more times in the month, but we meet several times, and we speak about how the school system can be different and how we feel. And so it's a place where we can change, and we can explain our perspectives and aspects of the school. And the purposes of the Student Equity Board is to create more inclusive room spaces and school policies through the lens of equitable curriculum. And yeah, as I said, I have some reflections and inspirations, and of course, some of my biggest inspiration is Dr. Jaber, because she really helped me in advocating for myself. And I think, like, if I didn't knew her, I wouldn't be here. And some other inspiration is my brother. He really helped me because, as I said, I don't live with my parents, and I think like he really helped me in as well advocating for myself and continuing my work. Now, I want to talk about the imposter syndrome, because I felt I was placed in EL classes, and then the transition from EL classes to AP classes was something I wasn't qualified for. I remember I had like not really good self-esteem, and when I walk into Dr. Jaber's class, I even asked her, do you think I'm able to be in this class? Do you think I'm qualified enough for being in this class? And what she said was really impactful for me. She said that I can elevate my voice, and she said that my language was not a barrier. So I'm here now talking to you about my experience, and I feel really grateful for this opportunity. Not only for this opportunity, but I feel I can make a change now, and I'm thankful for that.
She already is making a change. Melanie is our informal leader who has taken it upon herself to really advocate for other bilingual students who come into the district. Like you see her kind of maneuvering and walking and talking in her beautiful Spanish to other students whose primary language is Spanish, and really getting them to think about their placement and things like that. And so she's become an informal leader in the building based on her advocacy, and in Student Equity Board, a really loud and proud and beautiful voice in really getting the student voice at the decision-making table in some beautiful and impactful ways. So she is a little powerhouse and a ray of sunshine, as you can see, always smiling and always positive and always willing to take whatever she's given and make something beautiful out of it. So I'm really proud of her. She's awesome. Thank you, Melanie. You're awesome.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Angel, are you there, my friend? Yay. Angel is an angel, but I'm gonna let him introduce himself.
Hi. So this is gonna be fun. Melanie is an absolute powerhouse, so love you, Melanie. But here we go. Here I am. So I'm currently sitting at home, but my name is Angel Morales. My pronouns are they, he, and I'm gonna be going into just some things, I guess, about myself first. I am a choir kid through and through. You will see me in every musical theater, every band thing. I love music. I love these types of things. So I'm all around the school all the time doing these things, which is definitely, it's a lot of fun. And my advocacy journey didn't start really until my senior year. And that was actually with Dr. Jaber pushing me to try to see some things that I hadn't seen in my own experience and in the people around me. So I guess I have two kind of aspects of my equity journey, which would be my involvement in the Student Equity Board and my AP English research class. And I want to go into research first. So Dr. Jaber was showing us how research can also be used as a form of activism in order to help bring awareness to and help uplift different identities that you didn't maybe not have realized were there before, and to use it to uplift the people around you. So my why for my AP research, I have this friend, and she had come out to me as bisexual. And when she had come out to me as bisexual, I'm gay, so I really, it was not a bad experience. But she was telling me how she had had a lot of bad experiences before with not only the people around her that were straight, but also people from the LGBTQ community around her. She had had people tell her that she wasn't actually bisexual, that she was just confused, and a lot of really nasty things. And it was really, really shocking to me because even though I had not been out at the time she had talked to me, I always felt like I would be supported by the people around me. And when she came out to me, her entire perception was so completely different than mine. So that's what I decided to do a little bit of research into and see, like, hey, what's going on with this? And I began to find how bisexual stigma is a term coined instead of research, and it's super duper common from both the LGBTQ and the straight communities as well. So I feel like I had no idea that it was there, and that's what I pushed to advocate for in my research, is this identity of people who are attracted to more than one gender, because it's not just bisexual people, it's also our pansexual voices, our plurisexual voices, and a bunch of other voices that aren't even covered inside of the research. Like all the terms and all the research that has been coined has been under the term bisexual, even though that's not the only demographic that's been shown to have these types of things. So my research went into these people, and I did it because these are people I care about. And the people who I interviewed for my research, I went quantitative. No, I went qualitative. It's the wrong word. Wrong word completely. But the people who I interviewed, some of them I knew really well, and some of them I didn't know at all. But all of them would share the same experiences. Even my participants who weren't out, to other people around them, they would have the same experiences as the people who were out. So that's kind of how I was pushing to advocate through my research. And my other fold to this is my Student Equity Board journey. I am a leader on our Student Equity Board's Welcoming Committee. And we focus a lot on top of making sure that our school is a safe space for all students. But what we were able to push towards this year is doing a lot of work on top of identity throughout our students and making sure that all of our students feel seen at our school. And this is student-led. So we're working through other students, and we pull our student body to figure out what identities we have and what we're not representing and what we're not showing in our school, so we can try to push for these uplifting of these voices throughout our school. And I realized through student equity a lot of the things that I didn't realize about myself at first, how I had never really seen a mirror of myself when I was growing up. And I was able to think back of the first time that I saw a mirror, which was seeing this musical called Fun Home. And when I had seen the musical, I was really, really deeply touched by it. And I didn't know why. But looking back, it was the first time I was able to see someone where I could be like, hey, that's me. I could see myself up there and all these other things. And when I started to see these experiences in my own life, I saw, oh, dang, these are important. These are really, really important for other people to be seeing of themselves. And we're not showing any of this for a lot of the kids in our school. So being able to see and understand the importance of this identity and the importance of seeing mirrors of yourself was like huge for me. And that's something that I'm still pushing forwards with even to this day instead of Student Equity Board as well. And I guess my last part that I wanted to touch on is this is because of Dr. Jaber. I would not have been involved in either of these things without Dr. Jaber. And because it's not easy to get into, and it's really, I feel like there was a lot of demystifying that needed to happen before I could take the step forward, because it was scary at first. And to have someone to push me to say, hey, try this out, it'll be okay, and just get me in the field and get me learning is the only thing that was really stopping me from doing it. So Dr. Jaber teaches English. It's not a math teacher could do for something very similar. The first time I ever saw a mirror was through a choir class. When we saw that musical for choir class, any teacher can push for it. And I feel like I think that's that made the biggest impact on me with this type of thing. And I feel like that's something that any teacher can do.
I don't even have words for you and for Melanie. I don't know if Melanie can come back on for a second, but you guys are such a gift to the world, not just to my class and to me, but to the world, because your voices are super powerful, and you sharing them and just being so brave. Really, I think a lot of adults struggle. And I was talking about that struggle from the very beginning. It took me till I turned 40 to be able to say some of the things that you are able to share right now. So I want you guys to sit in that, and I appreciate you both. Does anybody have questions for the students before, if they want to go? I want to give you the opportunity to enjoy your Saturday. So if anybody has questions for them, I think they're happy to answer any questions that the audience has.
I have a question. What would be your advice to teachers to like how to be supportive and what would have helped you, for a teacher to do?
I think I can answer this, and then you, Angel. Well, my advice to teachers is just feel and make every student welcome. Don't assume, and make room for those conversations, because those conversations are important, and those conversations really shape who we are as students. And really take a moment to teach outside the curriculum, to teach what's new, what's happening in the world, because sometimes we don't even have the room for those conversations at home. And the only room or the only space where we can have those conversations is in the school. So really having a space to speak and to show us and to advocate for ourselves.
Building off of what Melanie said, I feel like ask is my biggest thing, because I have a friend who he is African American, and when there was a shooting of another person around where we live, I decided to just check in on him, and I was like, hey, are you doing okay? How are you feeling on it? And he broke down. It was really a hurtful experience for him that he needed to work on. Sorry, 1 second, I'm being called from home, but 1 second. Oh, spaghetti is ready, so I'm going to be going soon. Anyways, though, it was a really experience that he was kind of bottling up. and he didn't have anyone to talk about it. Our school is primarily Latin A, and from there, our biggest demographic is the white students. There wasn't someone who asked about these things or he felt would understand. And being able to have that talk with him really, really helped. And it wouldn't have happened unless I asked. And I feel like just asking your students and just having an open conversation about things that are going on will lead to a lot of these conversations and seeing what needs to be touched on further and what needs to be elaborated on and things.
Awesome responses. Melanie, there's a question for you in the chat that says, was your language a barrier with teachers? If so, how was that handled?
Yeah, I mean, at first, I think it was a barrier, but I felt like how to communicate with other students, and I didn't even knew how to communicate with myself sometimes, and so I had to learn English. And although I in Guatemala I spoke a little bit of English, but here I learned more. But with teachers, I felt that connection was from the transition from EL student to AP classes, and the connection from AP teachers to and EL teachers was the same. So I don't think it was a barrier at first, but then I learned how to speak English and how can it be handled. I think if you speak with your students, it can be handled, and if you ask them how they feel, or it's not even about language, it's about their emotions and how they show them to you.
Awesome. Thank you both again for being here. Go enjoy your Saturday. I appreciate you both. I think for the rest of the session, there's a lot more to share. There's just a lot. It's never enough time, no matter how much time we allot for it. So I'm just going to go through some questions, and there are specific lessons. If you follow me on Twitter as well, at SJ Educate, I'm always sharing lesson plans and student outputs on there. And if there's anything that interests you, I'm happy to share specific lesson plans with you. But sorry, that's not what I wanted to do, slideshow. Just some really, I always like to end with some questions that get people to think about the things that they need to be thinking about. Really just starting with like the idea that this starts from the beginning of the year. So instead of spending the first 2 weeks like we were taught in most educational programs to really establish procedures and establish like policies and establish rules and come up with your rules. We don't even have rules in my classroom. My rule is just let's respect each other. I think that's the most important and only rule we need. Once there's respect, then everything else kind of falls into place. But really getting to know kids beyond the surface. We spend the first 2 weeks immersing ourselves in literature and having students create outputs that really get them to understand who they are as people. And the first one is names, the name story, like telling their name story, because in my dissertation, one of the first things that I noticed was that even kids who knew that they were speaking to somebody who spoke their native tongue were butchering their names because they felt like they were othered more when their names were pronounced accurately. And so creating space for students to own things like their name is one of the first steps to telling them, I accept you, I love you, I care about you, I want to pronounce your name, I care about where your name comes from, what does it actually mean, right? And so we do this name story, and we do literature from Elizabeth Acevedo, who I absolutely love because I feel like she paints with words, and Sandra Cisneros spoken word. And then I write my name story, and then I have them go back and write theirs. And you would be surprised how many kids don't even know where their name actually comes from or what it means. And so this has becomes an interrogative process, but things like this. Then kids are talking about the hyphens in their identity. We listened to a talk by Sarah Ahmed on Heinemann, and it's called Hyphens in Our Identity. And she talks about her intersectionality as an American Indian Muslim on the day of 9/11 and how she felt, and really kind of interrogates the idea of being a female, being Muslim, being Indian, and how she was a little bit detached in comparison to her parents when it came to faith because of the stigmas related to the faith. And how even checking in on neighbors and on a mosque next to her when her mom asked her was something she felt super uncomfortable with. So it gets us to really think about the hyphens in our identity. And I have a student who's an Afro-Latina, and she I always say I watched her journey through her hair throughout the entire year. At the beginning of the year, she would straighten her hair all the time. And then as the year progressed and the conversations progressed, she started to come in with different hairstyles. First it was braids, then it was her natural hair. And then with time, she started to talk about her bicultural background and how she felt in a primarily Latinx school district to really identify with one or the other. Like she couldn't just embrace both, and what that felt like for her. And with time, really got to become an advocate for being, like Angel said, a minoritized majority in a school, a minority within a minority in a school, but then also living in that third space and feeling invisible in a district that's much more progressive than most other districts when it comes to this work. And it all started here, right? It starts with these name stories. It starts with like interrogating the hyphens in our identity and spending the first 2 weeks really getting below the surface into who you are and why you are the person that you are today. And so I just wanted to share that. And then share the fact that authentic audiences and project-based outputs are really central to the class as well. Getting students to create things like TED Talks, Wakelet pages, public service announcements, read one, write one, poetry. Every time they read one, like we read dialogic poems about a Native American sitting on a massage table with a white massage therapist, and the conversation is one that's full of stigmas. And then the students go and write a dialogic poem that mirrors maybe the structure, but about their own lives. And I'm getting into those deeper conversations about how they feel about themselves. They journal all the time. And the journaling is very social, emotional oriented. It's a place that I also learned that they need to process their own learning so that they're not harming other students in the space, because like adults, kids are all over the place with their understandings about equity. And so one of the things I learned, which was a mistake that I didn't do in the beginning, was I need to give kids a place to process individually and have those one-on-one conversations with them so that I'm not harming other kids as they work through their own journeys. And so the journals became very, very central to processing, but also giving them, after COVID, the sentence stem, I wish my teacher knew, and allowing them to talk to me about things that were happening in their lives that were primary, if what we were doing in the classroom wasn't as important, was really key as well, because almost all of my students at one point or another in their lives used the I wish my teacher knew stem to tell me about things that were really happening. And again, that gave me a window into, this is what Melanie's going through today. This is what Angel's going through today. How can I address their needs? How can I modify instructions that how can I give them grace, right? And I always say, as educators, we need to learn how to give students grace. And in order for us to give them grace, we need to understand what they're experiencing. And so that's another really big thing that I think happened. Wakelet, Flipgrid, something as simple as a Google Doc, which is where we use our journaling, is such a powerful tool here. This is really a form of liberation, and this is where they get to share with authentic audiences and get the real-time feedback on the work that they're doing in the classroom as well. I'm going to skip this slide and kind of just go through to the questions that I think are really important for educators to consider to start this. And because this is not cookie cutter, like I said earlier, if you're teaching in a primarily white school, this work looks different. And if you're teaching in a minoritized majority school, like I hear a lot of teachers saying about our district, oh, our school is so diverse. It really isn't. It's a school that's a minoritized majority is not diverse, right? And so we have to be intentional about creating opportunities for our kids to engage with other communities if we want them to have that diverse perspective. And with technology today, and especially post-COVID, that's the easiest thing to do ever, right? So through Flipgrid and through other means, we can bring communities together to discuss a text, an essential question, share your story. It's as simple as that. Create a podcast. My students create a podcast series. They create an episode for every unit, and they share that out. So the first question is, how do we use instruction to create mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, ultimately leading students towards opportunities to be content creators? That's a huge one, right? That's what we want. We want them to be content creators. We want them to amplify their voices and see the power in that amplification. How do we ensure that students are able to notice, name, and interrupt inequities? That's a really big one as well. How do we use technology to provide students with authentic audiences beyond their classroom peers, especially when they are more of the same demographic in their classrooms? It becomes more important for them to really engage with different perspectives outside. How do we examine positionality, integrate connections to the real world, events and skills, and develop critical consciousness and tools for civic engagement through instruction? And English this can happen across curriculum, but English is probably, and social studies are the most comfortable places for this work to live, because through literature, you really can engage with an entirely different world, through poetry, through simple things like documentaries, right? We can open, and now I have been so privileged to have friends from PLNs all over the world and nationally come into my classroom every Wednesday for lightning talks, and really just engage students on the different ways that they've been activists and been able to notice, name, and interrupt in their fields. And that's been super powerful to see students, role models who look like my students engage, but also to just have that worldly perspective of this is what it looks like in so many different spaces beyond our own local community. It's super powerful. And how do we normalize student feedback and build leadership ability through that process? Even if the feedback is criticizing something that you're doing in the classroom, how do we welcome that, right? And then grow our practices as a result of that feedback that we're receiving from students when we're creating space and we're saying to them, your opinion matters, your perception matters, what you think is working for you or not working for you matters. Because at the end of the day, we can develop ourselves as much as we want to, but every community has specific needs, right? And I think I did a lot of interviewing of graduates from our district before I shaped this curriculum, because I wanted to see where they felt like they needed to grow, where they felt like they weren't prepared. And then I took a lot of that data and I fed it back into my curriculum in order for me to make sure that I was filling in those gaps for the kids that were going out into the world. And so that constant feedback is shifting my practice because the kids are changing. Anybody who didn't teach before COVID, who didn't teach after COVID, doesn't know what education today looks like. For the most part, it's a world that's completely different, and the needs of the students are completely different. And that's one of the things that I find myself kind of leaning more towards: less rigorous, longer texts that engage students, and then supplementing rigor with supplemental texts like poetry and peer-edited research, and students reading things like Beverly Tatum's The Complexity of Identity, Who Am I?, which is something I read in college, but getting them first interested in the topic and then supplementing with the harder reads, in order for me not to compromise the rigor for the sake of the conversation, but to bring all of those worlds together. And that's something I didn't have to do before COVID, but I feel like our students are in need of feeling engaged, feeling connected, feeling social, emotionally, like there's a place for them to process the way they're feeling today. And all of that is ways that I've been able to kind of bring all of those threads together, because as educators, we were all told meet students' social emotional needs, and nobody was given a toolbox on how to do that. We had to figure that out on our own, and it became another thing on our plate. So this was a way that we could all bring it together. And so those are the 5 questions that I'm going to leave you with to start thinking about. How can you integrate that into your classroom and start to think about doing these things and making those mindset shifts we talked about in the beginning in your own practices with your students, in order for us to really achieve equity in our classrooms and get students to speak up. And with that, right, we started with self-competence and agency. And so our charge is, may we dig up the roots of our deepest beliefs about education that have never served children at the margins. May we nourish a process of truth and reconciliation that frees us from the grip of white supremacy and restores the inherent dignity of and worth of every human being. That is what I'm charging you with. That is your call to action. And I want to leave you with that, to really think about traditional systems in education and traditional teaching, and know for a fact that has never served the kids at the margins. And what we need to do is to figure out how to do that. And these are some really great tips through years of experience that I've developed that I feel like really work with that end in mind. And so I know I've kind of spoken to the last minute, but I want to give everybody an opportunity, if there's questions, to ask me directly. And again, we can engage with this conversation after the session in a multitude of, you can email me or you can tweet at me, and I'm happy to help support this work. All right, well, thank you all for taking time out of your Saturday. I know the work week is brutal. I appreciate all of you for being here. I hope that there's something or some things that you can take away with you from this session to your classroom, to your school. I appreciate you. And again, if anything comes up for you later, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or through email. I'll share my email in a second. So you have it. That is my email and my Twitter. So if you would like to email me, and if there's resources the things that you like, lessons or things that I can share with you. Again, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm constantly posting my students' work and things that are happening in our classroom. I'm happy to share and spread the work and the word as much as possible. Thank you again for being here today.
Thank you so much. It's so important to hear the theory behind it, but to also get the personal story of why it's so important, and then to go further into the practicality of this is how you can actually do this in your classroom. Love it. And then the cherry, or even like the icing on the cake, is to actually hear from students. We don't hear from students enough when it comes to what's truly important. So what, and like, I feel like this session could have been like a full day session. So what an amazing session. Just thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Desiree, and for creating this space for all teachers and educators to have this plethora of resources. And we appreciate you too. This is awesome. Thank you.